I'm Matthew, and I am going to be talking to you about web accessibility in terms and tools that you already know. Just a little bit about me to start with. I'm involved with the W3C. I have two roles within W3C. I'm a member of the technical architecture group, and I'm a co-chair of the Accessible Platform Architectures Working Group. And both of those groups look at all sorts of standards proposals that are coming out, accessibility or otherwise, and make suggestions to the people that propose them to help them improve them. The technical architecture group looks at overall architectural fit for the web platform and does some very deep reviews in that regard. And the other group, whose name is very long, does specifically accessibility reviews, amongst other things, but that's just a flavor. Also by day, I work as head of web standards at Samsung Research and Development Institute UK, and leading a small but awesome team working on all sorts of standards across the platform, and in support of Samsung Internet, which is our browser. What we're going to look at today is we're going to do a speed run of accessibility. We're going to then talk about accessibility in terms that you already know. And then we're going to look at some practical things that you can do as developers to experiment with accessibility. But why are we here? So Frank Herbert said, fear is the mind killer. Very insightful phrase. And when we talk about web accessibility, sometimes our pulse begins to race because we've just been told to do this thing and we want to do it, but we don't necessarily know how to do it. And then when you start thinking about web accessibility, you move on to assistive technologies, and it gets a bit scarier because then you think, of course, of screen readers. This is a picture of a Terminator, not a screen reader, but that is how it makes you feel when you boot up a screen reader for the first time and it starts talking at you in its scary robot voice. But as lots of people over the years have observed, knowledge is power. And as technical people, you already have the knowledge that you need to understand how accessibility actually works under the hood. So you can tame that robot somewhat. Okay. But before we go on to that, just a couple of really important things. A range of accessibility barriers exist. It's really important to bear that in mind. And also a range of assistive technologies exist to address them. You will see me using one of them during this talk. It's called the manual zoom. When I get to the live coding, you'll see me do the manual zoom. Excuse me. Okay, and also, pretend that you've just seen Jerry's talk, which is going to be awesome, about shifting left. You need to do that. She will explain what it means, but basically, accessibility needs to start from the design stage. This is a technical talk, or it's aimed at technical people who want to understand how accessibility works in the browser so that you can debug it a bit more and understand it as developers. But by the time stuff gets to you as a developer, it should have already gone through a very robust process of consideration of the user's needs and all sorts of good stuff that Jerry is going to talk about. So, accessibility speedrun. Okay, I have got a form on the screen, and this is, I'm just going to tab through this form with the screen reader, and it's not going to say anything. There we go. So we've got one text box which is blank, another text box which is blank, and the sound is a bit choppy, unfortunately, but I'll tell you it's saying that there's a button there. So what do you think this form is? Can anybody guess what this form is? It's got two text boxes and a button. Login. Login. It is a login form, so I am going to tab through it. Username. Okay, now we've got the labels associated. We can hear what it's about. I'll just try that again. It's not saying what I want it to say, which is because it's missing off the beginning of a button. I'm going to try this one more time. There we go, sign in button. But it says login on the screen. Why? We'll get back to that. Okay, so how do we make things accessible? Okay, what you do is you don't make them inaccessible. It sounds glib, but it's actually quite true. The web is full of things that are designed to be accessible. So buttons, you put some text in a button, it becomes its name. You can associate form controls and their labels. You already know how to do this. Headings work. You can skip around between heading levels. You can use landmark regions. If you don't know what they are, we'll talk about them briefly later, but use things like main and nav, and people can skip to parts of a page really easily. But why do they work? We know we should do them, but why do they work? And what if you're making a custom widget that does something that isn't done by a standard element? How do you make that work? One of the big things that people ask for is to put images and other stuff inside select choices, and you can't do that with a standard element. So people make custom ones, and then they have to do the accessibility. However, actually with this particular use case, because everybody asked for it so much, the OpenUI project is working on an element that will hopefully become a standard that does this stuff for you. So this might get a lot easier in future. But coming back to, okay, how do we make things not inaccessible? We use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which I'm sure you've all heard of. But just very briefly, you need to follow 4 principles, and the guidelines inside WCAG are numbered along with these principles. So perceivable, the user needs to be able to take in your content. They also need to be able to interact with it or operate it. It needs to make sense to them, so it needs to be understandable to them, and it needs to work across all of their devices and assistive technologies. And if you want a good guide on how to do that, there's a quick reference for WCAG, which is really, really cool, and it tells you all the detailed things to do. But again, why do these actually work? What are the underlying mechanisms? Well, we're getting to it. So when you think about somebody browsing the web, you've got the content which you provide, and then you've got the browser, or the user agent, as we often call it in standards circles. And then you've got the user, and the user interacts with your content through the user agent, okay? But if they are using an assistive technology, you've got the content, then you've got the user agent, and then you've got the assistive technology, whatever it may be, which talks to the user agent, and the user interacts with some combination of the assistive technology and the user agent. So sometimes the assistive technology does some translation for the user. In order to do this, they need to talk to each other, the AC and the user agent, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk. So you actually already know how this works. I am certain that this stuff that we talk about will be familiar to you, and hopefully it will help you understand a bit better how this stuff functions. So I'm going to talk about trees, objects and properties, and orders of precedence. These are all things that as techies you've come across. So trees, okay, the accessibility tree. We're browsing a web page. This is a page which has a picture of a rainbow cake and a button called light candle, and I will see if I can get the screen reader to actually talk about it. Oh, no, I can't, because I forgot how to use my own slide system. I need to press one more button first, okay. And now if I press G, it takes me to the next graphic on the page, and it says figure cake because it's in a figure element. And how does it know it's a cake? We'll get to that. And I've tabbed onto the light candle button, but I'm not going to have a naked flame in the room, so don't worry, I'm not going to press it. But how does this actually work? Well, if we look in the DevTools, we can see this very familiar view, which is the browser creates the DOM tree in memory, and this is like a living version of your HTML, and all sorts of stuff can happen to it. We can expand it like this. We can see the image in there. We can also see if we're using a particularly evil web framework, like the Aperture Science web framework, we get div soup. So it's full of things like class names like Aperture Science 1500 megawatt super colliding super button container wrapper and stuff like that. And it's those all the way down, lots of div soup. This is what you're familiar with looking at. But If you're an assistive technology, you need some of this information, but not all of it. So let's just look at the accessibility tree, which is very familiar. It's stripped out a lot of stuff. It's taken away all the div soup because the divs don't add anything meaningful to the page, but it's kept things like the figure. It's kept things like the caption in there. With some divs which have been ignored, and then you've still got the image with this alt attribute and all that sort of good stuff, and the button. So this accessibility tree is like a subset of the DOM that you're familiar with that just contains the stuff that's important for accessibility. That's as simple as it is. So let's talk about objects and properties. Okay, so when you make your web pages, your web content, these things, these links and images and stuff, they become living objects in memory. And they have properties like the link has an href, the image has a source attribute and an alt attribute, and also the image has a text content property, which is the text inside the node. From an accessibility perspective, what's important then? What do we need to know if we're an assistive technology to help our user? So for every element or object in the system, we need to know its name, what's it called. If there's a description, there might be some ancillary info, like instructions for filling in a form field, quite optional, but could be useful. Its role, what does it do? Its state, what's been done to it, and its value, input from the user. So let's go through a couple of examples. This is a button. It knew it was a button, so it said button. Its name is release for hounds. It doesn't have a value, and it doesn't really have a state. Let's just ignore disabled for now, because that's something that you're probably all familiar with. I'm just concentrating on new bits for you. But we can trigger the button, and then something happens. This is text in a box. So it says edit text in a box because it's a text box and there's text in it. But there's no name, so the role is text box, the value is text in a box, or I might change it to Slarty Bart Fast. And it doesn't have a name, which is really naughty. So if we look at the properties here, it doesn't have a name. So we don't know really what to do with it. So let's fix that. And we can fix it by just adding in a label. What's your name? And I'm going to be lazy, but also cool, and wrap the label around the thingy. And now if I inspect it, after wrapping it in a label element, it says what's your name from the label. It gets that from the label. So that's pretty good. Very easy. So the next one, this is a checkbox which also doesn't have a name, so that's bad. But it does have a state, it doesn't have a value. So the state is checked or not checked. And the last one, Samsung Internet Browser. This is the image, and the Samsung Internet Browser is the alt text for the image. So this has alternative content that can be provided. So this is why all that best practice stuff that you're told to do works, because standard HTML elements expose all this stuff for you. Sometimes you need to provide attribute values or alternative content, but it all works. The plumbing is all there. It all gets exposed through that tree, and the AT picks it up. If you make a custom element, you have to provide all of that information because it's not there by default, and the behavior, including keyboard handling and the styling. So this is why generally you should avoid doing that. If you do need to do it, you can use the role attribute and the various ARIA dash attributes that you've probably seen. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is another standard from W3C, which helps you provide this information. And like WCAG, there's a really good guide if you need to make custom widgets on how to do that. But again, the goal is to try and avoid needing to do that. But if you do need to do it, there's a good reference there. So let's also talk about order of precedence. Again, this is something that you're familiar with. So this example is a table with a shopping basket and some remove buttons at the ends of each of the rows. And the remove buttons, all they've got in them is a Unicode wastebasket character. So let's see how that gets announced.
Beach mode top, figure, table, wastebasket pineapple row 2 column 4, wastebasket ironing board row 3 column 4.
So that was quite handy. Because I switched between rows of the table, it was clever enough to use the row header to give me some context as to what the labels were, which is cool. But one way that people browse around is by looking at the names of the buttons on the page, and they're both just wastebaskets, so that's not really very useful. We can make this more useful, so let's try and do that. First of all, we can look at the button and inspect it and see that the name comes from its contents, which is the Unicode wastebasket, and it announces that as wastebasket. So you can kind of maybe guess what this button does, but it's not necessarily entirely clear if you're not browsing visually and you're not aware of the visual relationships between stuff. So what we can do is we can add an attribute which gives it a label, or a name, I should say. So we can say remove. And now, what's happened? The order of precedence has kicked in. It could have looked at the contents of the element for its name, but I've said, no, actually, I want to override that, and I want to give it the name remove. So that's pretty cool, but there's a problem. Can you spot what the problem would be if I did this for both of the buttons? They'd both just be removed, so I haven't actually really improved stuff that much. So what we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that the row header has an ID as well, and we can override this again and include both the row header and the name remove in the the name for the button. So I will just do that now as well. And what I'll do is I'll say aria labeled by, and I'll give the ID of the button itself, which is going to be remove. So that's remove 1. Did I type that properly? Yes, I think I did. Manual zoom, as I said. And remove, and the ID is item 1. And that should say, yes, remove pineapple. And it comes from, again, we've gone up another level in this order of precedence. This is overridden what we had before, but it's also referencing itself, which is kind of cool. So now the button label is remove pineapple. And if we look in the list of controls, I've only done the one, but you can, oh no, you can't see that because that's the DevTools list, because the DevTools is also our web page, which is also cool. So button remove pineapple. So it's in the list there, that's what the screen reader will say. And so that's just using this order of precedence to your advantage. Also, again, very simple. Oh, and coming back to this sign in, why did it say sign in? Because somebody had put an aria label attribute on it that said, well, it was me actually, but the point is, you might think, well, why did I do this? It's a silly example. It's actually not a silly example. This happens a lot because frameworks tend to try and be helpful, and sometimes they are a bit sort of enthusiastic about setting these attributes, and as they say, out of sight, out of mind. You can't see this as a visually browsing person, but it's there, and it's very easy for these to go out of sync, so it's really important to bear that in mind. Right, okay, so last little section. Practical tools. Well, we've just looked at the dev tools quite a bit, actually, as you noticed. The mouse on its own is good. I mean, this is mouse in conjunction with dev tools, but I've just got a picture on the screen of the sort of pop-up that you can get when you are inspecting something in the page, and it will tell you things like its role, its name, whether it's keyboard focusable, its contrast ratio. It's really, really helpful. Also, I've got on the screen now two identical looking checkbox with labels. They're both a checkbox followed by a label that says agree to terms and conditions, but there is a difference. If I try and click on the first one, I just end up selecting the text. If I click on the second one, I actually activate the checkbox. That's because the second one is done with a label element. Now, you might know this already, but it's super cool because it gives you a bigger touch area, and you can tell that these are associated. Now, the top to could actually be programmatically associated, because you could have used aria label or aria labeled by, but using the label element gives you this extra bonus, which is the touch area. And it's also possible to make the second one not work by using aria label too. So you still have to check, you have to get people to test your stuff. But as a spot check, this should give you a bit of confidence that some thought's gone into the way it's been coded. But of course, the real power tool is obviously the keyboard. Everybody knows using the keyboard is cool. If I have a form here that says email address, sign in with access code and a terms and conditions link, and I can hover over this sign in with access code button. But when I use the tab key, it skips over it completely, and that's because this isn't really a proper button, it's just a span. So I mean, I don't need to tell you don't do that, but just to reinforce how useful it is to just try and use something with the keyboard. Okay, last little bit. Browser limitations. So the DevTools are amazing. You've got all this power to hand now, and I hope that you can see how how things are working and maybe how to debug stuff a little bit. But there's some things that browsers don't do or don't expose yet. I talked about these elements earlier, or some of them: aside, footer, header, main, nav, and section. Under various circumstances, but most of the time, let's say, when you use these, you get something magic called a landmark region, and that allows somebody who's using an assistive technology to skip to that part of the page. So you can skip over the navigation links, you can go back to the navigation links, you can go to the footer, you can go to the main content, you can get an overview of what's on the page in terms of broad areas of it, and it's super, super awesome. But the browsers don't really expose it. I mean, you can inspect them and get the appropriate roles, and so you can see the role that's being exposed through the DevTools, but it won't show you a tree that you can use to like check things. It won't let you visually highlight them, and it won't expose them to people who don't use assistive technologies. Lots of people who use a keyboard might want to access these, but they can't. Except you can use browser extensions. This is one I maintain, but it's not the only one that works in this area. It allows you to navigate landmarks with the keyboard, and it also shows you a little tree in the DevTools with some information about how you might want to improve the accessibility. But this is the landmarks browser extension. But hopefully browsers will do this at some point. The DevTools are always improving, so you never know. So the bigger picture, again, come and listen to Jerry's talk. I know there's one other talk as well, and I'm sure it's going to be awesome, but these fit together really well, in particular, as far as I'm aware. Other stuff, prefer using standard HTML elements, have real people test your work, please do that if you possibly can, and don't be afraid to experiment. So hopefully the scary robot is now looking a bit more friendly. This is a picture of Roz from The Wild Robot, who's cradling a delicate little bird in her hand. So thank you very much for listening. I will publish these slides at some point soon. Until then, there's some acknowledgements for the images I used. Thank you very much.